hours. All right, so we're starting the content for our third lecture exam. It's officially starting today. Okay, so what we start today and cover through the next couple weeks is what's going to be on your lecture exam 3. For studying for this, the very first 2 chapters that we cover are cellular respiration, which is where we are today, and then also photosynthesis. These are both processes, okay, or processes, I think is the way to say that. They're very detailed, and I've chunked it in a way to help you learn it, but we're going to I'm going to set the stage, and then I'll expound upon it. Then I'll set the stage, and I'll expound upon it. And I'm going to be factoring in quite a few memory things, because these processes on the test, you have to be able to distinguish the two, and they're very, very similar. Okay, things about them are very, very similar. So we're going to start here with cellular respiration, and everything that we cover in this chapter has to do with this organelle. What organelle? This is the mitochondria. Yes, the mitochondria. Okay, the process. First of all, what is the mitochondria responsible for doing? Not protein synthesis. That's a ribosome. Energy. Remember, and when we initially talked about this, I was like, the mitochondria, and someone said, the powerhouse of the cell. And I said, you can't really say that in college because we don't say that. We say the mitochondria is the site of cellular respiration. This is the name of the process for making ATP. Cellular respiration is the name of the process that is carried out in the mitochondria that makes ATP. Cellular respiration is the name of the process that happens in the mitochondria that makes ATP. And again, as you already said, ATP is energy. Yes. So I just want to dissect the name so that you can understand where we're looking at it, from what perspective. So it says cellular respiration. So what level is this process occurring on? Inside the cell. This isn't respiration like you and I breathing, although I'll get there. This is cellular respiration. This is happening inside your individual cells. And you have over 100 trillion. So this process is happening exponentially in your body. Okay? So when it says cellular respiration, this process is occurring at the cellular level. Not tissue, not organ system, but at the cellular level, which is why we have those individual mitochondria in there. So the cellular part is here. Now, what is respiration? Let's talk about that part. Breathing. Respiration is breathing. Like when you respire, that's breathing. So tell me what gas we take in. Oxygen. And what what gas do we release? Carbon dioxide. Guess what gas goes in? Oxygen. Guess what gas is released? Carbon dioxide. So this is happening at the cellular level. Oxygen is going in and carbon dioxide is being released. Cellular respiration makes ATP. Happens at the cellular level. Oxygen comes in, carbon dioxide is released. I just want to dissect the name, because if you see the name, then you can kind of figure out what's going on in that process. Now, right above where it says cellular respiration, it says harvesting chemical energy. Harvesting chemical energy, which is carrying out cellular respiration. Cellular respiration makes ATP, which is our energy. What do we need in order to make energy? Food. Food. So we're using food to create energy. Big picture. When you're studying all of this, it might get a little complicated. I have a way of teaching it to you where it's very straightforward. But when you're thinking to yourself, oh my gosh, I don't even know how this applies, because you'll do that. Big picture for cellular respiration, we're using food to make energy. Big picture. As you're going through all of this, at the end of the day, this is used to take food and turn it into energy, ATP. Okay? This whole process, food and turn it into energy. And the process of turning it into energy is called cellular respiration. Do you recall the term for turning ADP into ATP? Phosphorylation. Fantastic. We're going to use that word a lot. So I'm going to remind you of that right now. Phosphorylation. So I'm building right now on what we already know, which is turning ADP into ATP. ADP into ATP. Question. Is this an anabolic process or a catabolic process? How do you know it's anabolic or catabolic? If it's building up, it is anabolic. And if it's breaking down, it is catabolic. And ADP, remember, that's adenosine diphosphate. So how many phosphates are there? 2. And it goes to ATP, which is 3, triphosphate. So it's going from 2 to 3. That's building up, so that makes this an anabolic process. You already know this. I'm just trying to lace what you know and relate it. Next question. If it's anabolic, what type of reaction takes place? Hydrolysis or dehydration? Dehydration. Dehydration, remember, you remove a water if you want to create a bond. Remember, dehydration was also called dehydration synthesis. Yes. Okay, I just wanted to kind of remind you of what you already know. I'm going to do the same thing on the next slide. But phosphorylation is the process of taking ADP and turning it into ATP. This is an anabolic reaction. Anabolic reactions require dehydration synthesis. So we remove a water to create a bond. Okay? I haven't said this in other lectures, but what biomolecule is ATP? Is it a carbohydrate, lipid, protein, or nucleic acid? It is a nucleic acid. Yes. Yes, yes, yes. It is a nucleic acid. So that means it falls right in line with DNA, RNA. It's a nucleic acid. Yes. Yes, yes, yes. Okay. Now back to this, which you already know this stuff as well that I'm going to discuss. But cellular respiration takes place in the mitochondria, but only if you are eukaryotic. Because the mitochondria is considered a membrane-bound organelle. And the only cells that have a membrane-bound organelle are eukaryotes, like you and I. So we have ATP that's created in our mitochondria through the process of cellular respiration. But what if you're not eukaryotic? What's the only other type of cell there is on Earth? Prokaryote, which means you're a bacteria. Do you remember what they use to carry out their metabolic functions? Their cell membrane. So prokaryotes use their plasma membrane, their cell membrane, their phospholipid bilayer to carry out any or biological membrane, yes, to carry out any type of metabolic process. So all living things need ATP. But like you and I, we make it in our mitochondria. Bacteria, they don't have mitochondria, so they make it at their plasma membrane. That's a test question. I just wanted to make sure I addressed it. A couple of other things. So again, both of these are throwbacks that I just mentioned. Do you recall what makes the mitochondria so unique when compared to the other organelles within a cell? What does it have that they don't? It makes ATP. What does a mitochondria have that it has its own DNA? Yes. A mitochondria has its own genetic material, its own DNA. So what does that give us evidence of? one point in time, this wasn't inside a cell. This was just out hanging around. All living things have DNA. So if this mitochondria, which is now inside one of our cells, has its own DNA, that indicates to us that this mitochondria hasn't always been inside this cell. It was once living on its own. Does anybody remember how it got in there? This was on one of the recorded lectures that I asked you to watch. Yes, the very first type of life was bacterial. Before plants, before trees, before any of that. Bacteria were just hanging out. And there was small bacteria and there was large bacteria. So let's just say that Andrea was a small bacteria and I was a large bacteria and we're just hanging out. And then all of a sudden, the large bacteria engulfs. Just like we're all hanging out and I'm like, engulfs the smaller bacteria. First of all, is that endocytosis or exocytosis? Endocytosis. And when I engulfed that smaller bacteria, what type of membrane, what do we call that membrane structure that surrounds it? A vesicle. Remember, it comes in through that plasma membrane, and I create that vesicle. Because I brought in a whole bacteria, is that pinocytosis or phagocytosis? Phago. Fantastic. Okay, so back to, we're just hanging out, and all of a sudden, I phagocytize her. And she's like, what just happened? I'm like, I don't know. I don't know what happened. This is really awkward. But how do they know that I didn't eat her? Like, I didn't consume her. She's still alive. She's like, what are you doing? I'm like, I don't know. Just, I don't know. Act normal. Okay, just go with it. But what happened over time is it happened over and over again. Larger bacteria were just phagocytizing, engulfing, and we knew they weren't using them for energy because they were still alive. That explains two parts of the mitochondrial structure. Number one, it has its own DNA. Andrea had her own DNA. I engulfed her. Does she lose her DNA because she's inside of me right now? No. So that shows us that this mitochondria once lived outside the cell on its own. It was once a bacteria. The second thing it explains is why every mitochondria has two cell membranes. Why does it have two cell membranes? It had its own, and then when I engulfed it, what did I put around her? A vesicle, which is a phospholipid bilayer. So mitochondria have two phospholipid bilayers. One that they initially had on their own, and the other they gained through the process of endocytosis. Unique characteristics that only apply to the mitochondria. Do you remember where you got your mitochondria from? Which parent? Your mom. Your mitochondrial DNA came straight from your mom. Your dad only gave nuclear genetic material, only the DNA that's in your nucleus. Mom, her egg had all your mitochondria. So your mitochondrial DNA is different from the DNA in your nucleus, which came from both of your parents. The mitochondrial DNA only came from your mom. So when we're trying to identify a body that's been there for a really long time and the nucleus has already disintegrated, we can use the mitochondrial DNA to match them back to a biological sibling that had the same mom or to the mom. Because all of your siblings, if you have the same mom, have the same mitochondrial DNA. Okay? The name of that theory that explains how the mitochondria got inside of that cell is called the endosymbiotic theory. The endosymbiotic theory. Endosymbiotic theory. What does the endo say? It's inside. So you got that part. Andrea's now inside of it. But what does symbiotic mean? Or symbiosis. Either one, they're the same thing. It's a relationship. It's a relationship between two organisms. And you've actually studied these before in high school, but you probably don't remember that that's what they were called. Remember like mutualism where they both benefit? or commensalism where one benefits and one's not affected, or parasitism where one benefits and one's harmed. Those are types of symbiosis or symbiotic relationships. So when I engulf Andrea, that's the endo part, and the symbiotic part is that it's a relationship between two living organisms. Okay? In this case, it's awkward for her, but we're both benefiting. Okay? So the theory is the endosymbiotic theory. That's the name of the theory that explains how that mitochondria got inside. All right? So again, that was on a previous lecture. Everything I've covered here is something we've discussed previously. Okay? When we talk about cellular respiration, which is the topic for this whole chapter, there are two forms, aerobic and anaerobic. And if you've studied for your word roots at all, you already know the difference. Aerobic and anaerobic. What does aerobic mean? Air. Aero means air. What is anaerobic? Without air. So, just using your common sense, aerobic respiration requires what? Oxygen. And when you say air, air and oxygen are the same, just so we know what we're talking about, okay? So, if you have aerobic respiration, you have access to oxygen. What about anaerobic respiration? No oxygen. You don't have access to oxygen. Something else is used. 99.5% of the time, you're carrying out aerobic respiration because you're breathing. Right now, this is all aerobic because you're breathing. When do you carry out anaerobic respiration? When you're not breathing. Give me examples, please. What'd you say? When you're dead? Okay, when you're dead, you're not going to come back to life. So clearly, yes, of course, that's anaerobic. But what about if I am going to come back to life? But I'm not saying that you died and came back to life. I don't mean when you're swimming. When you're swimming, that's anaerobic because you're not breathing. Okay? When's another time that it's anaerobic? I'm just going to hold my breath. Anaerobic because you're not intaking new air and oxygen. When you're sprinting, like you're going to take off for a sprint, not an aerobic jog, but an anaerobic sprint. Even though you may be like breathing very shallow, it is not a meaningful, productive breath. You're not breathing all the way down through your lungs. The oxygen is not getting to your tissue. So if you're sprinting, tell me what you do as soon as you're finished with that sprint. Breathe. In fact, we can watch runners, and as soon as they're done, they hyperextend their back slightly, and we call it post-exercise oxygen consumption. Why not just say taking a deep breath? Because we have to sound super fancy. But after you do something anaerobic, the very first thing you do is to increase your O2 levels. Sprinting, weightlifting. A lot of times when you're lifting weights, your coach or your weight partner needs to tell you to do what? Breathe. Hey, breathe. You're going to pass out. Because you're holding your breath trying to get those reps in. That's anaerobic. When you're pooping, in order to create enough pressure in your abdominal cavity, you have to flex your core. In order to do that, you have to hold your breath, close your glottis. That's anaerobic. I bet the next time you poop, you're thinking, this is an anaerobic activity. Yeah, you'll never look at it the same. Don't look at your poop, but I meant like the process. Okay, the process. So in aerobic, we have oxygen as a reactant. What does reactant mean? It's on the left. So is it going in or coming out? Going in. In anaerobic, we have something other than oxygen as the reactant. Okay? Something other than oxygen as the reactant. Either way, this is the type of respiration, so that means that ATP is being produced. So aerobic versus anaerobic. Normally, anaerobic activities increase muscle mass. Aerobic activities increase endurance. if you're talking about it from a physical standpoint. Okay? Questions so far? Now, this is completely new content. I'm going to link it to something you already know, but this right here is new content. The topic is redox reactions. The topic is a redox reactions. And the term redox is actually a combination of oxidation and reduction put together. So it's both of these words combined creates the word redox. Redox reactions are a combination of oxidation and reduction. I want to define the terms first and then show you how they come together. It says here that oxidation is the removal of electrons. Removal of electrons. When you remove electrons, there was another thing we looked at. We talked about ions. When you remove electrons, do you create an anion or cation? Cation, it's positive. It's positive. Oxidation, you're removing electrons. You're removing electrons. I'm going to tell you, this is not like here on this slide. This was Jessica teaching myself how to do this and analyze equations. But when something is oxidized within a chemical reaction, it will always get smaller. I'm going to show you what I mean, but it will always get smaller. The number of atoms will decrease. The number of atoms will decrease. It will get smaller. Reduction is adding electrons. When we talked about ions, which we have, what did we create when we added electrons? If cation was removing them, anion was adding them. So potentially there could be a negative charge here. A lot of them will be balanced, but still, I'll show you what I mean. So we're adding electrons. As a result, and this is Jessica studying in my head again, throughout the chemical reaction, it will get bigger. So the number of atoms will increase. The number of atoms will increase. The compound that gets smaller has been oxidized. The one that gets larger has been reduced. The molecule or compound that gets smaller has been oxidized. The one that gets larger has been reduced. So, on this example, here I have methane. And when I did these initially, I can do really complex ones now, but when I initially was learning how to do it, I had to figure out a way to interpret these. So I counted the number of atoms. So right here, even though it's labeled methane and I know that's methane, I would count how many are there. So there's 4 hydrogens and 1 carbon, so I would write a 5 under here. How many atoms are here? 4. You take these 2 numbers, you multiply them, so there would be 4 here. So I have 5 here, 4 here. This is on the reactant side. On this side, how many are here? 2 oxygens and 1 carbon, so that is 3. And I have my energy. How many atoms are here? 2 times 2 is 4, so that's 4 hydrogens plus 2 oxygens, so a total of 6. So I would write those down. I would write those numbers down. I would count atoms first. Then, to determine what was being oxidized and what was being reduced, I would find the bigger number on the reactant side, which in this case was 5, and I would find the smaller number on the product side, which is 3. Methane was oxidized to carbon dioxide. It got smaller. It lost electrons. Over here, I had 4. That was the smaller number. And over here, I had 6. So oxygen was reduced to water. It gained electrons. It got bigger. Okay? When we have the reactions that you and I are going to study for cellular respiration and for photosynthesis are both redox reactions, which means something is being oxidized at the same time something else is being reduced. So redox together is where oxidation and reduction are happening at the same time. Oxidation is the molecule that is losing electrons. Reduction is the molecule that is gaining. Okay? Questions here? So, energy flow. What I'm about to say, we basically know. I'm going to add some clarifying aspects to it. First of all, the ultimate source of energy is the sun, and we said that in chapter 1. But who actually gets energy from the sun? Okay, plants is an option, but I need a collegiate response. Plants is something I would expect if you're like, oh yeah, but are plants the only thing that gets energy from the sun? There's something more broad. Not all eukaryotes, because you and I are eukaryotes. Do we get energy from the sun? Not all living things, because that means that we get our energy to make food from the sun. Do we do that? No. Because fungi don't get their energy from the sun. You and I are referred to as heterotrophs. Autotrophs means what? They are self-feeding. Autotrophic organisms get their energy from the sun. We've already discussed the fact that you and I don't get energy from the sun. Because if we could, what would we do? Yeah, I'd be like, ooh, I want a number 7 with Texas toast, mayonnaise instead of mustard. Go ahead and make it a large fry. And it would be like, we would have tons of money. Because we could just absorb the sunlight and have our own food. But we can't. Because we are heterotrophic, which means we use something else for food. But organisms that are autotrophs use the sun for food. So instead of saying plants, plants are an autotroph, but there's also autotrophic bacteria. Algae is a protist, and it's autotrophic. So when you say plants, it's just too small. We have to say something bigger. So autotrophic, or you could also say organisms that are photosynthetic. Anything that is photosynthetic. Anything that is autotrophic or photosynthetic. Now, you are not wrong if you said that we indirectly get energy from the sun. We do indirectly get it because we consume organisms that do get their energy from the sun. But when we say what organisms directly get energy from the sun, it's autotrophs or photosynthetic organisms. Okay? I just want you to be able to distinguish them. And those organisms that do get their energy from the sun carry out photosynthesis, which means they use energy to make food, specifically organic molecules. And we've used this term before. What's the organic molecule that most autotrophs make? Glucose, sugar. So, autotrophs, or photosynthetic organisms, use energy to make food. And organisms, everything that carries out cellular respiration, so all living things, use food to make energy. Photosynthesis uses energy to make food. Cellular respiration uses food to make, they're the exact opposite of each other. So I'm going to teach you the more complex one first, because when you can get the hard one first, the second one comes much easier. in the grand scheme of things, the sun gives its energy to photosynthetic organisms. Those photosynthetic organisms take that energy from the sun and turn it into organic molecules or food. All organisms, whether they're photosynthetic or not, will use energy or will use food to make energy. When you read this description, I need you to understand what it's saying. For cellular respiration, it says organisms obtain energy by oxidizing organic molecules. What does oxidizing mean? It's making it smaller. So is that catabolic or anabolic? It's catabolic. And if we're oxidizing organic molecules, what are organic molecules? Like our food. Yeah. We're making our food smaller and turning it into ATP, energy. Yeah. All living organisms carry out this process. All living organisms do. Only photosynthetic or autotrophic organisms carry out this process. So as this energy is being transferred, it's going from the sun to the autotrophic organism to make food, and then that food is turned into energy. So energy to food, then food to energy, energy to food, food to energy. But how does that energy get moved around? Because remember, energy cannot be created or destroyed. So we have to take what's from the sun and used by the autotrophs to create energy for ourselves. How is that energy transformed around? You already know this answer. But what is it that we're moving back and forth that changes the energy from potential to kinetic or to chemical? We are getting that energy from food, but we're moving electrons. Those oxidizing and reducing. Moving electrons back and forth transfers that energy. We're not making new energy. We're taking something that has energy, moving its electrons and putting it somewhere else. So that energy transfer is carried out by the movement of electrons. By the movement of electrons. That transfer of energy is carried out by the movement of electrons. I want to go back real quick. I'm not going to go back on the slide because I know some of you are writing, but to this part where I said oxidizing and reducing. Now that you know it's electrons moving back and forth that are changing the states of energy. When I oxidize something and I remove electrons, am I releasing energy or storing energy? Because it's catabolic, I am releasing. So oxidizing releases. It gets smaller, so it's releasing. What does that mean for reduction? I'm gaining electrons, and as a result, I am storing energy. When you break it down, you oxidize it, you release those electrons, you're releasing energy. When you gain the electrons, you're storing energy. When it's reduced, it's getting bigger, so it's holding that energy in. So, tell me what goes into photosynthesis. This is my big picture throwback. That when you're panicking, when you're studying, you're like, what really is happening overall? Big picture, what's going into photosynthesis? Oxygen's not going in. Sunlight is. What else? CO2 and water. Does it make sense that carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight go into photosynthetic organisms? Yes. And what does the photosynthetic organism release? Glucose, and it releases oxygen and produces glucose. So it used energy to make food, an organic molecule. It used energy to make food, an organic molecule. What are we going to use those organic molecules for now? To make energy. We used energy to make food, then we'll use food to make energy. Energy to make food, then food to make energy. It just circles over and over and over again. We use that glucose in cellular respiration. And right here it's telling you that we had ADP and it becomes ATP. What's this process called again? Phosphorylation. Is that catabolic or anabolic? Anabolic. I'm having two and I'm creating one. That's anabolic. Dehydration synthesis has occurred. Oxygen also goes into cellular respiration because respiration is taking in oxygen and releasing carbon dioxide, and that carbon dioxide goes into photosynthesis and so on, and it's a cycle. So we use energy to make food, food to make energy, energy to make food, food to make energy. The chapter that we're studying is this part right here, the food to energy. The next chapter is energy to food. When I go through and we're about to move into drawing our mitochondria, my suggestion is this. When you know it enough that you can explain it, you know it enough to do well on the test. I will tell you this, unless you have someone who just happens to be interested in science, this is going to be extremely boring to them. So I suggest you talk to your dog or your cat because they're always excited to see you, right? And you could be like, and then pyruvate oxidation occurred, and your dog will get excited, right? And that emotional excitation will help you remember the material. It's very detailed. We're going to break it down, but it's one of those things where as long as you can explain it, you know it enough, okay? So, here's the equation. The question is, do you have to memorize it? The answer is yes. When I was first exposed to this equation, I felt it was overwhelming. I was like, this is too much. Okay? So I wrote what each thing was, and I'm going to explain that to you, because if I can see the words, then I can figure out what goes in the blanks. Okay? So what is C6H12O6? Sugar, it's glucose. I'm telling you, if you don't learn one thing in this class, it needs to be C6H12O6. All I need you to do is be at a stoplight and think about that. Oh, the molecular formula for glucose is C6H12O6. It might be a trivia question, like for $1 million, and you would know it. Okay? So glucose. So I write here glucose. O2 was oxygen. The thing that trips some students up is the coefficient. So sometimes the equations have coefficients, sometimes they don't. And so that's what becomes confusing, especially if balancing equations and chemistry and all that was not your fave. It becomes a little bit confusing. So I would write down, I know glucose and oxygen go in. They're reactants. They're on the left side of the arrow. What's released? Carbon dioxide, water, and energy. So I would put carbon dioxide, water, and energy. So I would write that on the back of my Scantron or whatever, because if I had those words, then I could find the things that fit in those blanks. What a question might look like is this. Which answer choice, or which of the following has the two reactants, or has the reactants for cellular respiration? And it's going to have, like, glucose and oxygen is one choice. It'll have glucose and carbon dioxide. It'll have oxygen and carbon, like it'll have all of those together. And then you're looking through them and you're like, but if you just come back to this, I know glucose and oxygen. So C6H12O6, O2. I'm looking for the answer choice that has those two. It's going to ask you the same thing about the reactants in the products. Okay? As far as which molecule is oxidized or which compound is oxidized and which one is reduced, you can count atoms like I did at the beginning, or because this is the only one you're going to have to know how to apply this to, you can just memorize this. Glucose is becoming carbon dioxide. Is it getting bigger or smaller? It's clearly smaller. So that's being oxidized. Oxygen is becoming water. Bigger or smaller? Bigger. So it's being reduced. You'll have to analyze that equation in that manner. Questions on that? Okay. Now, we are going to draw mitochondria. I strongly suggest you use the whole page sideways, because we're going to write in the middle of it. We're going to start it today, and we will finish it in the next lecture. Start it today and finish it in the next lecture. I'm going to kind of center it better. If you don't want to include all the squigglies in the middle, you don't have to. This is just the best black and white image I could get because I wanted to be able to write on top of it. I bet you can't guess how many steps there are in cellular respiration. What makes you think there's 4? There's 4 numbers. Yeah. There's 4 steps. Step 1 is glycolysis, and I'm not moving ahead yet. I'm just kind of setting the framework. Step 1 is glycolysis. Step 2 is pyruvate oxidation. Step 3, citric acid cycle. Also called the Krebs cycle. Step 4 is called the electron transport system. You may also hear this called the electron transport chain. These are our 4 steps. For each of these 4 steps, you have to know 5 things. You have to know the location, the conditions in which it occurs, that reaction occurs, the reactants, the products, and the level of phosphorylation. And the level of phosphorylation. And of course I'm going to tell you all that, but these are the characteristics that you need to know. I'm going to just throw this out here. We'll do location first. And what we're just setting framework today. But where do you think step 1 occurs? It's outside the mitochondria. So what do we call the area outside the mitochondria? Cytoplasm, if I wanted to be more specific, I could call it the cytosol. Cytoplasm is not wrong. Collectively speaking, cytosol is more specific. Okay, so I'm going to put both. Where does step 2 occur? Yeah, it's just inside. It's in the mitochondria. Which is why I like to have you diagram it, because then you can physically see it. What about step 3? It's also in the mitochondria. Yes? What about step 4? It's also inside the mitochondria. Okay? Based on what we learned at the first part of this chapter, we talked about the conditions. There's 2 types of respiration, aerobic and anaerobic. Aerobic means it has access to air or oxygen. Anaerobic means it doesn't. Inside your organelles, there's access to oxygen. But outside, remember the cytosol is kind of like a jello. Can you breathe in jello? No. So are the conditions outside aerobic or anaerobic? They are anaerobic. The conditions out here are anaerobic, which means no O2, no oxygen. But once we move inside the mitochondria, we now have access to what? Air or oxygen. So this becomes aerobic, which means it has access to O2 or oxygen gas. In order for step 2, 3, or 4 to occur, step 1 has to take place. So right now, with you and I sitting in this class, and we have adequate access to oxygen, which steps are taking place in our body? Which steps are happening to us within a cellular level? Steps 1 and 2, all of them. All of them. Because in order for 2, 3, and 4 to occur, 1 has to. And the only way 2, 3, 4 can occur is if we have oxygen. So right now, because we're breathing, we're carrying out steps 1 through 4. Let's say you're swimming. What steps are you carrying out? Just 1. When you aren't breathing, you just carry out step 1. Let's say you're sprinting. What steps? Just 1. What about walking down the hallway? All through 4. All through 4. 1 through 4. Yes. So if you're breathing and it's an adequate amount of oxygen that's coming in, you're you're going through all 4 steps. Okay? Now, the last thing I want to touch on for this is the level of phosphorylation. So, in step 1, you're going to release 2 ATP molecules. 2 molecules of ATP are released. And I'm going to kind of draw that little burst thing around it because ATP is usually represented. And this level of phosphorylation, because that's what we did, we created ATP, is called substrate level. And I will explain what this means in our next lecture. I'm just trying to lay the groundwork right now. Okay, so in step 1, we create 2 molecules of ATP, and it's referred to as substrate level phosphorylation. In step 2, no ATP is made. In step 2, no ATP is made. Moving on to step 3, an additional 2 molecules of ATP are created. And this is also substrate level phosphorylation. In step 4, you get anywhere, and it depends on what book you're studying, okay, because the number kind of fluctuates, but it's anywhere from 32 to 34. Some books may say 30, so don't get upset if you see that, okay? 32 to 34 ATP molecules, which is markedly more than we've produced in the previous steps. But this doesn't take place substrate level. This is referred to as oxidative phosphorylation. I bet you can't guess what's going to happen if it's called oxidative. It's going to get smaller. Things are going to be oxidized, so are they going to gain or lose electrons? So that's just a foreshadowing for the events that are going to occur in our next lecture. But let me explain. So again, there's 5 things that you need to know about each step. And what we covered today was the location and the conditions, whether aerobic or anaerobic, and then also the type of phosphorylation that occurs. In the event that you're holding your breath, you're sprinting, you're swimming, you're lifting weights, you're pooping, whatever it is, what step are you carrying out? Just 1. How many molecules of ATP are you making? 2. If you're breathing, collectively, how many molecules of ATP are you making? Collectively, altogether. 2, 4, anywhere from 36 to 38. That's a whole lot more. So what happens when we do anaerobic activities? How do we feel afterwards? What is our energy level like? It's lower because we've made fewer ATP molecules. When you do things like lifting weights and sprinting, you get tired more quickly because you're not making as much ATP, as much energy. So this is you right now making adequate amounts of ATP. But if you're about to go work out and lift weights, you're going to see that your levels of ATP are going to drop because you're doing anaerobic activities. Okay? I want to show you what this looks like in the textbook, and then we will be finished. So this was Jessica's way of explaining it, like drawing this diagram, because this helps me understand it. Your book doesn't have this diagram. Your book has this diagram. Here. So the 4 stages are listed here. Stage 1, glycolysis. Stage 2, pyruvate oxidation. Stage 3, the citric acid cycle, also called Krebs. Why is it Krebs with a capital K? Some guy, some scientist, didn't want you to forget about him. Okay, so that even though he's gone, you know who discovered it. Step 4, the electron transfer system, transport chain. It could be any of those. Also referred to as oxidative phosphorylation. So those are the 4 steps. Then this is their mitochondria. This right here is the same thing that I drew down here. It's just in a box type shape. It's not as cool. So look, the first step is glycolysis. Where does it occur? Cytosol. And it makes ATP, and we call it substrate level. Step 2 is pyruvate oxidation. Where does it occur? Inside the mitochondria. How much ATP is made? None ATP. Step 3, citric acid cycle. Where does it occur? Inside the mitochondria, and it makes ATP at the substrate level. Step 4, the electron transfer system, oxidative phosphorylation, transport chain, whatever. It occurs also in the, produces ATP, but we call that oxidative phosphorylation. So this diagram is the one in your book. It's the same as what we drew. I just want you to see how to interpret those. What questions do you have? Okay, this is where we're stopping for today.